History hides patterns that psychology dares not speak aloud. When World War II ended, tens of thousands of women across Europe and Asia left their families, cultures, and nations to marry foreign soldiers. At first glance, it looks like romance. But beneath the surface lies something older, deeper, and more unsettling: the truth about female hypergamy, the instinct to seek security, power, and survival through men. What does this tell us about love, desire, and human nature itself? Hypergamy is one of those concepts that sounds clinical, almost like a sterile academic term, but it cuts to the heart of something primal, something that makes many men deeply uncomfortable when they first encounter it. At its core, hypergamy is the tendency for women, whether consciously or unconsciously, to seek men of higher status, greater resources, or stronger survival potential than themselves. It has been called marrying up, but that phrase is far too narrow. It is not simply about marriage, nor only about money. It is an instinct embedded deep within human psychology, older than written history, older even than civilization itself. To understand hypergamy, one has to understand the raw mechanics of survival that shaped our species. For most of human evolution, women were the ones who bore the immense risk of childbirth. Pregnancy made them vulnerable, nursing tied them to the infant, and the survival of their children often depended on whether a man could provide food, protection, and stability. A woman who chose poorly risked not only her own life, but the lives of her offspring. Evolution punished those mistakes harshly. Over millennia, this forged a psychological compass: seek the man who can provide, who can protect, who will endure. That compass did not vanish when humanity invented cities, smartphones, and modern equality. It adapted. Carl Jung might describe this drive as an expression of the archetype of the animus, the masculine energy within the female psyche. Women are drawn toward men who embody qualities of power, authority, and decisiveness not merely because of cultural conditioning, but because those archetypes resonate with deep, unconscious symbols. A woman might insist she is only attracted to a man's kindness or sense of humor, but when pressed, the figures who dominate her imagination tend to share something else: competence, command, the ability to bend reality in his direction. Modern science, too, confirms what ancient intuition already knew. Studies on mate selection consistently show that women, across cultures, rate social status, ambition, and resource acquisition potential more highly than men do when selecting partners. Men, conversely, tend to prioritize youth, beauty, and fertility cues. These patterns are not products of propaganda or patriarchy; they are biological strategies that ensured survival across countless generations. Hypergamy is, in a way, the female mirror to male desire for youth and fertility. Each gender is playing a different strategy in the same brutal game of genetic survival. But when men first confront this reality, they often feel betrayed. They want love to be pure, unconditioned, eternal. They imagine that a woman could love them simply for who they are, stripped of context. Yet the truth is harsher. Hypergamy whispers that love is never entirely detached from power. A man's potential, his capacity to provide, to lead, to create stability, shapes the depth of attraction more than his sentimentality or sincerity. This does not mean women are calculating opportunists, coldly weighing salaries against each other. Hypergamy is not a spreadsheet, it is a feeling. It is the way a woman's body reacts to confidence, to security, to a man who seems like he could weather storms. She might not even understand why she is drawn to him, but the pull is there, relentless and ancient. To see this in the modern world, you only need to observe dating culture. A woman in her 20s, presented with two men, one charming but unemployed, another less exciting but with direction, ambition, and stability, will almost always lean toward the latter. She may even convince herself it was purely about compatibility or shared values. But underneath, her psychology is aligning with the man who represents safety and growth. This does not make her shallow. It makes her human. The instinct is invisible, but it governs choices with enormous weight. Consider also how hypergamy adapts to context. In a society where wealth is the marker of power, women seek wealthy men. In a tribal society, it might be hunting ability or physical dominance. In the chaos of war, it becomes food rations, uniforms, and foreign passports. The instinct is flexible, but the underlying drive remains the same: align with the man who offers the greatest chance of survival and security. And men, too, unconsciously know this, which is why so much of male behavior, ambition, competition, the desire to prove oneself, is often directed toward making oneself a viable candidate in the ruthless arena of hypergamous selection. What is often missed in surface-level debates about hypergamy is that it does not always operate cynically. Women can and do fall passionately in love, sometimes recklessly, sometimes even against their own best interests. But even love tends to orbit around the gravitational pull of hypergamy. A woman might describe her partner as the only man who makes me feel safe or the one who inspires me. These are poetic ways of describing an instinct that is, at its root, about survival and flourishing. Even in the language of romance, the shadow of hypergamy can be heard. This is why dismissing hypergamy as shallow or manipulative misses the point. It is not a cultural defect. It is not a modern invention. It is a law of nature, a principle written into the structure of human desire itself. And like all such laws, it cannot simply be wished away. It must be understood, accepted, and integrated into our vision of what it means to be human. Hypergamy is the background hum of history, the quiet force behind countless decisions that shaped families, societies, and civilizations. And when upheaval comes, as it did in the world wars, this instinct, normally hidden, suddenly becomes visible, undeniable, and shocking. War is the great eraser of illusions. In times of peace, society gives us the luxury of pretending that love is purely about affection, choice, and free will. We can talk about ideals of romance, fidelity, and equality, and we can believe, for a moment, that human nature is civilized and stable. But when war breaks out, when bombs fall and hunger gnaws at the belly, those illusions collapse almost overnight. The structures that normally protect people, governments, economies, families, are shattered, and suddenly, raw instincts come rushing to the surface. Status, once tied to polite symbols like careers or social standing, is reset by violence. A soldier with a weapon and rations instantly holds more power than a shopkeeper, a teacher, or even a husband who cannot feed his family. War exposes the mechanics of survival in a way no peacetime condition can. The Second World War was perhaps the clearest example of this reset. Entire cities reduced to rubble, millions of men dead or captured, economies destroyed. In such an environment, the old markers of status became meaningless. The man who once held prestige as a banker or lawyer was now penniless, standing in ration lines, powerless to protect his wife or children. Meanwhile, soldiers from victorious armies carried not only weapons but also food supplies, cigarettes, chocolate, and medicine. These items were not luxuries, they were lifelines. A uniform became a visible symbol of dominance, safety, and a future. Women, facing starvation or violence, could read those symbols instinctively. They were drawn to them, not out of frivolity, but because survival demanded it. Nietzsche once remarked that war strips away the false veneers of morality and reveals the naked will to power. What he meant is visible in this historical moment. In peacetime, relationships often appear governed by culture and choice. But war uncovers the deeper law, that life orients itself toward strength. Women seeking soldiers during or after World War II were not betraying some noble ideal of love, they were responding to the most basic truth, that those who aligned with strength had a better chance of survival than those who clung to weakness. Think about the psychology of a woman in occupied Europe. Her husband or fiancé may have been killed, imprisoned, or left broken by years of conflict. Food is scarce. Violence lurks outside the door. She sees an American GI, well-fed, confident, offering supplies that could keep her and her children alive. Her instincts flare. On the surface, she might tell herself that he is charming or that she admires his smile. But beneath that story, something more ancient is at work. It is the same instinct that guided her ancestors to choose the strongest hunter, the fiercest protector. War has simply created conditions where that instinct becomes visible, urgent, and undeniable. This reset of status was not limited to Europe. In Asia, too, women aligned themselves with soldiers, sometimes despised by their own communities for doing so, but nevertheless compelled by the logic of survival. A uniform, whether American, British, or Japanese, represented order in the midst of chaos. The soldier had access to resources. He could offer a way out of hunger, a passage to another country, or simply the protection of his presence. In those moments, lofty ideals of romance seemed like luxuries that no one could afford. What mattered was survival, and survival meant attaching oneself to power. Psychologically, war also created an aura of hyperreality around soldiers. To women who had endured fear, loss, and scarcity, the soldier represented not just physical safety but symbolic authority. He embodied decisiveness in a world of uncertainty, dominance in a landscape of ruin. Jung might say that the archetype of the warrior was magnified by the circumstances, appearing larger than life, becoming a gravitational force around which women's choices naturally orbited. Even women who might have resisted such impulses in peacetime found themselves caught in the pull when the old structures collapsed. It is important to notice how quickly this transformation occurred. Before the war, social norms might have prevented women from openly pursuing men outside their class or nation. Shame, reputation, and community expectations acted as restraints. But when war demolished the community itself, those restraints dissolved. A starving woman cannot worry about gossip. A widow with children cannot afford to prioritize ideals of purity or loyalty. The instinct to survive overrides cultural rules. In this sense, war reveals what has always been present, that human nature adapts ruthlessly to the conditions it faces. And this is why war is such a profound reset. It reshuffles the hierarchy of men overnight. A man who might have been invisible in peacetime becomes powerful because of his role as a soldier. Another, once respected, becomes powerless because he cannot provide. This sudden inversion of value systems is not random, it follows the deeper logic of hypergamy. Women orient themselves toward the new symbols of strength and stability. They are not making cold calculations with pen and paper. They are obeying the whisper of instincts older than civilization, instincts that tell them where safety lies. To men, this can appear as betrayal. To women living through it, it feels like survival. War does not create hypergamy, it amplifies it. It takes an instinct that is always present, usually hidden beneath layers of culture, and magnifies it into stark reality. What we see in wartime is not a distortion of love and desire, but rather their most unfiltered form, stripped of illusions, bound to survival, and relentlessly drawn toward strength. The phenomenon of the war bride is one of the most striking and controversial outcomes of the Second World War. In the years following the conflict, tens of thousands of women across Europe and Asia left behind everything they knew, families, cultures, languages, entire nations, to marry foreign soldiers. On the surface, the stories were dressed up as romances, tales of brave young men and hopeful young women finding love in the ashes of war. But beneath the soft glow of those narratives lies something far more complex, something that unsettles both men and women when examined closely. The war bride was not simply a figure of romance, she was the embodiment of a survival instinct colliding with history's chaos, a living expression of female hypergamy under extreme conditions. Imagine the psychology of a young French woman in 1945. Her city has been bombed, her father killed, her brothers missing at the front. Food is scarce, and winters are brutal. Into this environment walks an American soldier, tall, uniformed, well-fed, carrying rations, cigarettes, chocolate bars, objects that seem trivial in peacetime but in those years meant warmth, nourishment, even life itself. She looks at him, and he does not only represent himself, he represents stability, abundance, and the promise of a future outside the ruins. When she chooses him, it may look like love, but it is also something deeper, an unconscious recognition of survival potential. Freud's concept of eros and thanatos, the drives toward life and death, becomes especially relevant here. In war, thanatos is everywhere: destruction, hunger, violence, loss. Eros, the life drive, asserts itself in the most urgent ways, through love, sex, attachment, the creation of bonds that promise survival. The war bride phenomenon can be seen as Eros rebelling against Thanatos, women reaching desperately for life in the arms of men who symbolized protection. A marriage, a kiss, or even a short-lived romance became more than a personal choice, it was a revolt against despair, a declaration that life would continue. But there was also another layer: betrayal and stigma. Communities often viewed these women as disloyal, traitors to their homeland, especially when they married soldiers of occupying forces. In Asia, women who married or associated with foreign soldiers were frequently ostracized, their children called names, their families shamed. In France, women who fraternized with German soldiers during the occupation were publicly humiliated after liberation, their heads shaved in the streets. Yet even those harsh consequences could not fully suppress the phenomenon. The instinct was too strong. To outsiders, it looked like treachery. To the women themselves, it felt like necessity. Survival rarely waits for moral approval. It is also important to understand that many of these marriages were not calculated strategies. They were deeply emotional, sometimes reckless, often filled with genuine passion. But the passion was always intertwined with power dynamics. A soldier's confidence, his uniform, his ability to offer escape, all of it created a gravitational pull. Jung might interpret this as the archetype of the hero becoming magnified in times of war. The hero, who slays dragons and offers salvation, becomes irresistible when the world itself feels like a dragon devouring everything in its path. For a woman standing among ruins, the soldier was the hero made flesh. Consider the sheer numbers. By 1947, over 100,000 war brides from Europe had been brought to the United States, Canada, and Australia. Thousands more came from Japan and other parts of Asia. Each of these women carried the weight of her decision, the tearing away from her family, the leap into a foreign culture, the gamble on a man she barely knew. Yet the pattern was undeniable. The attraction was not random, it was structured, predictable. Women consistently aligned with soldiers from victorious or powerful nations, men who carried not only individual appeal but also the aura of dominance. To see how this worked psychologically, think of the contrast between two men standing side by side in 1945, a local man, thin, unemployed, traumatized by years of war, and a foreign soldier, clean-shaven, laughing, with food in his pockets and a ticket to a better life. Which man does instinct favor? The choice seems almost cruelly obvious. Hypergamy, the drive to seek higher value, is not suspended during crises, it becomes sharper. And in the eyes of a woman staring at hunger and despair, the soldier's value shines like a beacon. This does not mean every war bride was cynical. In fact, many of them reported falling deeply in love, describing their marriages as genuine connections that endured decades. But love and instinct are not enemies, they often cooperate. A woman may feel deeply for a man, but her attraction has already been filtered through the silent criteria of survival. That filter is invisible, but it is always present. The war simply stripped away the distractions and made the criteria brutally obvious. For men, the war bride phenomenon was often hard to accept. Local men left behind saw it as betrayal, humiliation. How could their women leave them for foreigners? How could they abandon culture, kin, and loyalty so easily? Yet this resentment ignores the larger truth, that in times of collapse, instincts rule. To judge a starving woman for choosing the man who can feed her children is to misunderstand the nature of desperation. She is not thinking like a romantic, she is thinking like a survivor. And this is why the war bride is such a haunting figure in history. She is not merely a character in a love story, nor a villain in a tale of betrayal. She is a mirror reflecting the deeper forces that drive human relationships. Her choice was not just about a man, it was about survival, power, and the timeless law that women, when pressed by crisis, will align themselves with strength, even at the cost of shame or exile. Carl Jung once described the shadow as the hidden, darker side of the psyche, the parts of ourselves we repress, deny, or refuse to acknowledge, but which nevertheless shape our behavior in profound ways. The phenomenon of hypergamy, when viewed through the lens of war, shines a harsh light on the shadow, both for women and for men. In the midst of collapse, when illusions of morality and social order are stripped away, the shadow takes the wheel. Women, often unconsciously, reveal a side of themselves that is pragmatic, ruthless, and unapologetically tied to survival. Men, in turn, reveal their own shadow, resentment, jealousy, and rage at discovering that love is not as unconditional as they once believed. For women, the shadow manifests in the willingness to abandon old attachments when they no longer offer security. A woman may have sworn eternal devotion to a husband or fiancé, but when he is dead, missing, or powerless to provide, instinct pushes her toward another man who can offer safety. In peacetime, such a decision might appear immoral, shocking, or shameful. In wartime, it appears inevitable. The shadow here is not evil, it is pragmatic. It is the recognition that survival trumps sentiment, that the children must be fed, that tomorrow matters more than yesterday's vows. Women may not consciously frame it this way, but their actions reveal it. The shadow whispers, align with strength, or perish. For men, the shadow often takes the form of bitterness and disillusionment. A man might believe that his partner loves him purely for who he is, for his soul, his humor, his kindness. Then he discovers that in the crucible of crisis, those qualities are not enough. She gravitates toward the man with resources, status, or protection. The male shadow erupts, anger at women, rage at their betrayal, despair at the thought that love might always be conditional. These emotions are not new, they echo through history. Countless myths and stories tell of men abandoned for stronger rivals. The sting is universal. What war does is make that sting unavoidable, magnified to the scale of nations. Freud might interpret this through the lens of repression. Men repress the knowledge that love is tied to power because it is painful to confront. Women repress their own awareness of ruthlessness in mate choice because it conflicts with cultural ideals of romance and loyalty. Yet repression never erases, it only buries. When war detonates the fragile structures of culture, these repressed truths surge upward like floodwaters. The shadow is exposed, and no one can deny it any longer. The Stoics, however, offer a radically different perspective. Marcus Aurelius wrote that one should not be angry at figs for bearing fruit in season, nor at vines for producing wine. In the same way, the Stoics would argue, one should not be angry at women for following their instincts. Expecting human nature to behave otherwise is folly. Epictetus might advise, do not demand that reality conform to your wishes, rather, adjust your understanding to align with reality. From this view, hypergamy is neither betrayal nor sin, it is simply nature. The suffering comes not from the instinct itself, but from our refusal to accept it. But this does not erase the darkness men feel when confronting the shadow. The humiliation of knowing that love is bound to status, that desire is tied to power, can be crushing. Nietzsche would say this is the moment when resentment, ressentiment, creeps in. Men who cannot accept the truth turn their bitterness outward, blaming women, society, or fate. They become cynical, sneering that all women are shallow, or retreating into fantasies where hypergamy doesn't exist. This is a failure to confront the shadow honestly. The shadow demands acknowledgement, not denial. Denying it gives it greater power. For women, too, the shadow has consequences. To act on hypergamous instinct in times of war may ensure survival, but it can also leave lifelong scars, guilt, shame, or alienation from their communities. The war bride who leaves her family behind may be haunted by the knowledge that she chose survival over loyalty. Jung would say that only by integrating this shadow, accepting it as part of herself rather than repressing it, can she find wholeness. To deny it is to live in conflict with herself, always tormented by the gap between what she did and what she believes she ought to have done. The interplay of shadows between men and women creates a dynamic of tension that extends far beyond wartime. Men resent what they perceive as betrayal, women defend what they experience as necessity. Neither side sees clearly, because both are blinded by their own shadow projections. Jung observed that what we most despise in others often reflects what we fear in ourselves. Men who rage at women for being ruthless may be blind to their own ruthless ambition in seeking youth and beauty. Women who condemn men for weakness may be disowning their own fear of vulnerability. War, by tearing away illusions, forces these shadows into the open, demanding confrontation. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this confrontation is how ordinary it all is. Hypergamy in wartime is not an aberration, it is simply human nature stripped bare. What shocks us is not that women chose survival, what shocks us is realizing that the same instinct operates silently in our own lives, hidden beneath the rituals of dating, marriage, and romance. The shadow unsettles because it reveals that we are not as noble, selfless, or pure as we wish to believe. It shows us that behind our talk of ideals lies something older, darker, and more real. To face this truth requires courage. The shadow is not meant to be destroyed, nor can it be. It is meant to be integrated. Jung warned that what we do not make conscious will control us from the unconscious. Men who refuse to accept the truth about hypergamy will be ruled by bitterness. Women who refuse to accept their own survival instincts will live in denial. Only by dragging these truths into the light can either sex move forward. In this way, the war bride becomes a symbol of the shadow itself, both feared and necessary, shameful yet honest, unsettling yet deeply human. She embodies the instinct that everyone wants to deny, but which everyone must eventually confront if they wish to understand themselves and others without illusion. If the war bride phenomenon exposed hypergamy in its rawest form, the modern world reveals it in subtler but equally pervasive ways. The conditions have changed, bombed-out cities and ration lines replaced by dating apps, Instagram feeds, and globalized economies, but the underlying instinct remains. Hypergamy is not an artifact of war, it is a law of attraction that still governs how men and women navigate relationships today. The only difference is that now it operates in digital spaces, through curated images, social hierarchies, and markers of status that look different from the past but serve the same evolutionary purpose. On dating apps, for example, women are presented with an endless stream of men. Yet studies consistently show that a small percentage of men receive the vast majority of female attention. This is hypergamy in action, women filtering for the men who signal higher status, ambition, or dominance. In evolutionary terms, the uniform and rations of the soldier have been replaced by the LinkedIn title, the luxury vacation photo, or the confident display of social influence. Men may complain about this unfairness, but it is simply the modern translation of instincts that once determined who survived famine and war. Social media amplifies the dynamic even further. A woman no longer compares herself to the men in her village or city, she now compares them to men she sees online, wealthy influencers, celebrities, athletes. The pool of comparison has expanded globally, raising expectations and fueling discontent. A local man with a steady but unremarkable job now seems unimpressive compared to the curated life of someone flaunting private jets or luxury brands. Hypergamy adapts, raising its bar in accordance with the symbols of status displayed in the environment. The war bride once measured value in chocolate bars and foreign passports. The modern woman may measure it in financial independence, blue checkmarks, and lifestyle. The logic is the same, only the symbols have shifted. For men, this reality provokes a familiar sense of disillusionment. Many struggle with the realization that their worth in the sexual marketplace is tied not merely to who they are, but to what they can provide, signal, or embody. Some react with bitterness, retreating into online communities that rage against women and denounce hypergamy as evidence of betrayal. Others attempt to bypass it altogether, convincing themselves that true love can ignore the gravitational pull of these instincts. But resentment and denial alike fail to address the root. Nietzsche's call to become who you are offers a sharper answer. If hypergamy is real, then the only viable response for men is not to complain about it, but to embody strength, competence, and direction so fully that they become undeniable. The rise of the so-called red pill movement is, in many ways, a cultural reaction to this modern echo of the war bride secret. Men confronted with the brutal reality of hypergamy either collapse into bitterness or attempt to weaponize the knowledge for their own advantage. They trade romantic illusions for strategies, teaching one another how to signal status, manipulate attraction, or outplay the system. Yet beneath the bravado lies a deeper wound, the pain of realizing that love is not unconditional, that affection is intertwined with hierarchy. This wound, left unhealed, often festers into cynicism and contempt. Women, on the other hand, often deny hypergamy outright, insisting that their choices are purely about compatibility, personality, or shared values. To admit the instinct is to confront their own shadow, the ruthlessness of survival embedded in their psychology. Many bristle at the accusation of marrying up, as though it cheapens love. And yet the patterns remain. Women consistently gravitate toward men who display confidence, security, and resources, even when they cannot articulate why. Their lived experience affirms what studies and history already reveal, that desire is rarely detached from power. The echoes of wartime hypergamy are also visible in migration patterns and global relationships today. Just as women once left their homelands to marry victorious soldiers, many now pursue partners from wealthier or more stable nations, seeing in them the promise of security and opportunity. To some, this looks like betrayal of culture or opportunism. To others, it is simply the modern face of an ancient survival instinct. What was once the war bride's chocolate ration is now the visa, the education, or the passport. The mechanism is the same: align with strength, escape instability, and secure the best possible future for oneself and one's children. In all of this, the shadow still lurks. Men struggle with feelings of inadequacy when faced with hypergamy, fearing that they will never measure up to the invisible hierarchy women seem to track effortlessly. Women wrestle with the dissonance between their instinctual drives and their cultural ideals of romance and equality. Both genders are caught in the same tension, shaped by instincts they cannot erase but also by ideals they wish were true. The war bride phenomenon reminds us that when crisis strips away the veil, instinct wins. The modern world, though cloaked in technology and abundance, reveals the same truth in slower, subtler ways. What this suggests is that the struggle is not about erasing hypergamy but about learning how to live with it. Men must decide whether to meet the challenge with bitterness or growth. Women must decide whether to deny their instincts or acknowledge them honestly. In both cases, the deeper task is integration, seeing clearly without illusion, and then choosing how to act in light of that truth. The war bride secret is no longer hidden in history. It has become the unspoken backdrop of modern love, a force shaping relationships in ways most people prefer not to admit. But whether in ruined cities or on glowing screens, the same instinct whispers: seek strength, seek safety, seek life. The story of the war brides is not just about history. It is a mirror. A reminder that behind the poetry of love lies biology, instinct, and survival. Hypergamy is not a villain, nor is it a fairy tale. It is the hidden engine of desire, the unspoken law of attraction. And only when we face it, without rage, without denial, can we understand what it truly means to be human in love and war.